Good afternoon. I think we're afternoon now. It's past midday. It's my appointed time to start. So thank you all for turning up and listening. You're going to be soaked in reading instruction over the next few hours. So lucky me, I get to be the first. So I'm just going to go through initially some of the evidence about reading instruction, and then talk a little bit about what are some of the problems at the moment in the way that reading is taught, and then talk about why that's the case, why it is so difficult to get what we know about how children best learn to read into classroom practice. So I've called my talk like frogs in a water well. I was trying to think of an analogy or some sort of image of what it's like to be someone who's at that interface between research and policy, and just thinking that finally that policymakers and program writers have got it, and then you slip down a little bit further. So I want you to try to imagine a frog climbing up a slippery, mossy water well and thinking they've got to the top, and then they slide back down again, and that's the frustration. Okay, so I work for an organisation called the Centre for Independent Studies. I was the one person in the room earlier that put their hand up when Tom said who works for a think tank, waved it around, I wasn't ashamed. And the CIS started a project called the 5 from 5 project a couple of years ago, and it was developed because we could see that there was an enormous amount of evidence about the way children learn to read. And it wasn't finding its way into classrooms. So we thought we would try to make that happen. We'd capitalise on the interest in evidence and the interest in reading instruction, and try to create some more momentum around that. So we called it 5 from 5 because there is a lot of research that shows that there are 5 key components to children becoming proficient readers. And they start with what we sort of think of as lower order skills, but are actually quite complex skills. But they are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary and comprehension. And I'll go back through in a few moments and spend a bit more time talking about those. So they're the 5 keys to reading, and the evidence suggests that they should start very early in a child's schooling, from the first time they arrive at school, so around the age of 5. Obviously there's a lot goes on before children start school, but there is mostly this great amount of evidence about formal reading instruction in the first few years of school. So we have a website if you'd like to go and have a look at that. So the 5 from 5 also has a number of supporting organisations. There's no money changes hands between these organisations and CIS. These are organisations and people who are supporting what we do in terms of promoting the 5 from 5 message, and vice versa, information sharing and collaboration. So as I said, this is roughly what I'm going to talk about today. I finished putting these slides together at midnight last night, and I got up at 4 o'clock this morning to get on a plane. So I'm going to be as surprised as you to see what's on the slides at the end. So we're going to go on this adventure together. So one of the reasons that there are such big variations in the amount of progress children make in learning to read is because of something that's called a Matthew effect. And that comes from a biblical story from the Gospel of Matthew about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And without really effective reading instruction, that's what happens with children as well. So those gaps open up very early, around the age of 2, some say earlier, but that's disputed. But they're certainly there by the time children start school. And those gaps can either grow or they can get smaller depending on the quality of the teaching that children receive at school, and that interacts also with a genetic component. So there's certainly a genetic component to reading, but that doesn't mean that that can't be impacted by both the home environment and by the school environment. Over the last couple of decades, a lot of evidence has coalesced towards what we now think of as the simple view of reading. So just because it's called the simple view doesn't necessarily mean that the processes that underlie these 2 factors are simple. They're incredibly complex. The model is simple. And the reason that it's called the simple view is because it just has those 2 major elements, and they are accuracy of word reading, so word recognition processes, and also language comprehension. So really it makes sense when you think about it. So in order to be able to read, you need to be able to make sense of what's on the page, to be able to convert those squiggles into words, which are then words that you recognise. You can draw them from your vocabulary, and then you can eventually comprehend. Obviously, there's a lot more to proficient and expert comprehension than that, but they are the two basic processes. So children who struggle with reading will generally struggle with one or either of word recognition or language comprehension, or the poor kids who really struggle get a double whammy and they struggle with both. Now, Simple View has been supported also through cognitive science. So what we are now finding out through cognitive science research is that there are specific areas of the brain that are engaged with the different processes. And there are biological evidence to show how that learning process takes place. So what we're also understanding now is that there isn't a reading section of the brain that just turns on when you start to learn to read. That reading requires making connections between areas of the brain that have evolved to actually do other things. For some children, those connections develop fairly easily, and so you'll see some children arrive at school and they can read, or it looks like they can anyway. They still need some teaching, but they have somehow managed to make those connections themselves. For other children, they will need really methodical, repeated instruction in reading in order for them to make those connections and to become proficient and automatic readers. So the brain research, the cognitive science research definitely supports explicit instruction rather than whole language instruction. So we're in this really nice place at the moment where we don't know everything about how children learn to read, but we do know a lot. And each new published study seems to provide more consistent evidence and just another level of detail. So English is a very, very complex language, and we know that it's got what we call a deep orthography. So that means there aren't simple one-to-one relationships between the alphabet and then the sounds that converts to in speech. So in other languages, that's quite simple. So languages like Finnish or Italian or Spanish, it's a much more straightforward relationship. So some people would argue that, for example, because English is a complex language and there are so many what look like exceptions to the rules, but in fact there are still a lot of rules, it's just it's a little bit more difficult to learn them. Because English is so complex, that means it needs to be taught really methodically and really carefully, because it's much less likely that children are just going to intuitively work out what those letter and sound correspondences are just by being read to, or by trying to work out the patterns for themselves. For a lot of children, that's just not going to happen. So yes, there are a lot of rules and what look like a lot of exceptions, but there are certainly fewer rules than there are words in the English language. So it's easier to learn the rules than to try and learn every word by heart. So the way that we try to mitigate those Matthew effects is through really expert reading instruction. And effective early reading instruction is based on that scientific evidence. It has significant impacts on all children. It impacts through the whole school career, through the whole school process, and it can narrow the literacy gaps that are associated with socioeconomic status. So I'm going to not spend too much time on the 5 keys to reading, because I suspect that a lot of you here know what they are. So just in case you don't, we'll start with phonemic awareness, and that's the ability to be able to hear and discriminate between the individual sounds in spoken language. So phonemic awareness in its purest sense does not have anything to do with making the connection between sound and print. It's just being able to hear the distinct sounds. And once children can do that, they're much more able then to be able to make that connection between the sound and the letters, or the groups of letters on the page. Phonemic awareness is part of a broader set of skills called phonological awareness, but it is the most sophisticated component or element of phonological awareness. Children who struggle with phonemic awareness tend to struggle with reading. Phonemic awareness, there's a question around correlation and causation there, but we do know that children who struggle with phonemic awareness are very likely to struggle with learning how to read. And there's an enormous amount of studies showing that correlation. The second one of the 5 components is phonics. Again, a very contested area, even though there's this huge amount of evidence supporting phonics instruction and how children learn to read using phonics, and how that allows them then to decode and to access pretty much every word they come across once they've learned that code. Phonics has a few different definitions, and all of those are appropriate. It can mean the body of knowledge around letter sound correspondences. It can mean the methods that we use to teach those grapheme phoneme correspondences, or it can mean that a child uses phonics, so uses their phonics knowledge to decode, and all of those are accurate. So what we have at the moment in terms of evidence on how best to teach phonics breaks down phonics instruction into these 3 main ways of teaching phonics. Teaching in inverted commas when it comes to the first one. So implicit or incidental phonics is just talking about letter sound correspondences as they crop up in reading of connected text. And so there is some sort of talk about patterns in words and so on, but there's no sequence of instruction. There's no bringing out of the letter sound correspondences and looking at them in an abstract way. No unpacking of that. Analytic phonics is a bit more systematic. There is more looking at word patterns, but it starts with the whole word and breaks them down. As opposed to synthetic phonics, which is the last one on that list, and that means you start with the smallest unit in sound. So there seems to be sometimes this misunderstanding about what synthetic phonics means, that it's all about nonsense words, and that's not true. Synthetic doesn't mean fake, it means synthesizing things from the smallest component. And the smallest component is initially letters, and then groups of letters, and children learning how those letters can be rearranged to make the words that they know and that they can read. So the evidence shows pretty strongly that synthetic phonics is the most effective way of teaching phonics to children, and synthetic phonics also encompasses that systematic and sequential approach. So systematic and sequential, making sure that every child learns all of the things that they need to know. There's no assumptions made about what they might know or what they might not know. It's not a letter a week or a sound a week, as sometimes it's characterised as. It can be as fast or as slow as children need in order to make sure they master that code. And it can be, it's not a matter of, children aren't allowed to read books until they've learned all of their letter sound correspondences. That's another misrepresentation that crops up from time to time. Certainly children with a synthetic phonics instruction program are still reading connected text. They're still being exposed to great children's literature. It's just that they are getting that sequential and systematic instruction in phonics as well. So as I said, there's a lot of evidence to show that phonics instruction, and particularly explicit and systematic phonics instruction, is really important. That some children might learn to read without it, but it's beneficial for all children, if not necessarily for reading, if they are children who have managed to work out how to decode, then for spelling, because that's the other aspect of it, that's the flip side. And phonics instruction is incredibly important for spelling. So the third thing is fluency, and fluency is really just making that decoding ability automatic. So children, once they become automatic in decoding and accuracy in reading, they're not labouring over every word. They're not spending all of their energy trying to work out what the word is. They're then spending their energy on focusing on the meaning. So again, fluency is highly correlated then with comprehension. If a child is able to attend to the meaning of what they're reading rather than trying to make sense of the words, they're much more likely to be able to comprehend. And again, some children manage to go straight from decoding into fluency. Others need a lot of practice and explicit instruction in fluency. Fourth one is vocabulary, and obviously it's not enough to just be able to work out what the word is and say it. You need to know what it means, otherwise you're not reading. And so that comes back to those two key elements, is when children have that store of word meanings and vocabulary. And vocabulary can more broadly mean So semantics, idiom. So it's not just individual word meanings, it's understanding the broader sense of what they're reading. So vocabulary is, again, highly predictive, obviously, in that case of comprehension, and vocabulary is something that it's very difficult for schools to make up or to close the gaps with. So phonics is what we refer to as constrained skill. There's a relatively limited amount of knowledge involved in learning phonics, whereas vocabulary is almost unlimited. That children who come in with a broad vocabulary become proficient readers more quickly, they're given good phonics instruction, and so their vocabulary grows. It's very difficult for children who struggle at the beginning of school to catch up with vocabulary. And finally, comprehension. Obviously, that's the end game. That's where we want to be able to extract and construct the meaning from what has been written. So, again, as I said, that we say comprehension, and that once you can decode and if you know words, then you're comprehending. But obviously, there is a lot more to it than that. And so, children who a group of children that are referred to as poor comprehenders, in that they struggle with comprehending even though they can read fluently and accurately. These are the sorts of things that need to be looked at with those children, that they're actually thinking about what they're reading, that they understand not just word meanings but how they fit into the context of what they're reading. So that comes into things like domain knowledge, for example. Having a good general knowledge is really important. And again, this shows the complexity of comprehension. So once we have decoding, once there's the vocabulary stories being built up, then you can focus on these sorts of things. Grammar and structure and all that stuff that if you introduce that too early, become quite confusing, but all of that needs to come into comprehension. So interventions are not things that are not special types of teaching. They tend to be effective interventions, at least tend to be based on effective instruction. So it's more about the duration or the intensity of instruction. It's not about, as has been called, some people sort of talk about interventions as, trying to place things into a different context, or go out and run around the yard, or those sorts of things, as though things that are not related to reading are not a reading intervention. It's very unlikely to be able to improve a child's reading by doing something that does not involve reading, and there are interventions out there that claim to do that. So that what I was talking about just now, all of that we can find on the 5 from 5 website, and that document there. Lots of references, so if you're looking for the references for what I've just been talking about, you'll find them there. So what we need in order to get all of that across to children, and it, as I said, sounds simple, it's so complex, there is so much going on there, and I've gone through it very quickly, but expert teachers are essential to that process. They need to understand the structure of language, and they need to know how to get that across to children. And explicit instruction tends to be for systematic and sequential teaching of reading, tends to be the most effective. So we can talk about lots of programs, and programs, though, even while they might be shown to be effective, they're only going to be as effective as the teacher who's teaching them. So if a teacher doesn't understand why a program is effective, how it works, what the nuts and bolts of it are, what it's based on, then they're not going to be as effective. So we come back now to teaching knowledge. And so one of the problems that have been identified, particularly with the teaching of reading in Australia, is that there is in general, low teacher knowledge about language. And this comes through time and time again. There are numerous studies that are showing that pre-service, beginning teachers, and even experienced teachers have not a very good knowledge of the way the English language works. And obviously, if you don't know something very well, it's really hard to teach it well. So that's what's called the Peter effect. Again, another biblical reference, which was in the Bible, that you can't give what you don't have, and in this context, you can't teach what you don't know. So what I'm going to do now is, rather than just making that statement, I'm going to run through some of the indicators that show that to be the case. Now, some of these things here that I'm going to show are pretty critical of some teachers, and I'm going to talk about some evidence, and I'm going to show some examples. So obviously it doesn't apply to anyone in this room, but I need to provide some evidence of what I've been saying. So my friend Pam here and her colleagues did a study recently and published that of prep teachers looking at their knowledge of language constructs. And I've just pulled out a few statistics here. There's a lot more in that paper, and I encourage you to read it. But this is pretty damning stuff. These are basic language concepts. It's not sophisticated. These are things really that every teacher ought to know. In fact, every person who's been to school ought to know these things, really. Only just over half could correctly define a morpheme, and that almost 2/3 thought that coloured lenses could help with reading difficulties. Is pretty frightening. A study that was published a few years ago was of teachers in a Queensland university, just so I'm not picking on Victoria. And these are fourth year, this is not first year, fourth year, did a relatively simple language test. And the average mark was 10 out of 14 for spelling, so there were quite a few a lot lower than that. Apostrophes, you'd hope that you'd know how to use apostrophes by fourth year at university if you're going to go out teaching. Identifying nouns, 12 out of 31. This is it's extraordinary. And as you might imagine, once they found out that these were the scores, the students said, actually, we'd really like to know a little bit more about literacy and language and how to teach it. Before they did this test, they thought that they knew it. They thought they had a good grasp of English language, and it wasn't until they were actually shown that they didn't that they understood that they'd been shortchanged. So not only are we seeing those sorts of studies, principals are expressing repeatedly that they don't have confidence in graduate teachers in how to teach reading. Again, pretty extraordinary. You would think that a primary school graduated teacher, if they don't know how to do anything else, they should be able to teach children how to read. Teacher employers don't have a great deal of confidence in the preparation of teachers in how to teach reading. This came from a statement to the TMAG review, and it was from all of the key authorities in New South Wales, people who employ teachers, and they were concerned because people were coming to them often. This was a theme showing that there were particular teaching approaches that were being favoured in ITE courses, and generally things like phonemic awareness and teaching of phonics were sidelined in those courses. So I'm just going to go with an example now. So I've talked about sort of generalisations, and I'm going to come down to a particular teacher. So now I've blocked out the names in this to protect the innocent. But this was a homework task set by a teacher, and I'm going to show you the correspondence between the teacher and the student. So the teacher is asked, this is the homework they set for this child, find from the list words on Soundwaves Kids, use the extension list if you want to challenge. Okay, so the interesting bit is the example of how to syllabify the words. So literacy has 3 syllables apparently, according to this teacher. Literacy. so clever child says, in our homework instruction for the syllable task, where literacy has been segmented like this, literacy, into 3 syllables, and he's been very polite. I think it's 4 syllables. And then he goes on to explain why it's 4 syllables, and very cleverly talks about closed syllables and R-controlled syllables and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, and then at the end he says, do you think that's right? And then the teacher says, personally I do agree with you, as when I pronounce literacy it has 4. However, I can see the other perspective, as though that this is a debate whether or not literacy has 3 or 4 syllables. It's just a matter of opinion. So, this is a problem. That's really basic stuff. So why is that? Why have we got to this point where there's all of these studies showing that graduate teachers and pre-service teachers towards the end of their teaching degrees have pretty low language skills. They're not confident in themselves. Principals and employers are not confident. How have we got there? Well, teacher education obviously is the problem, in literacy in particular. And you don't have to look very far. I've not gone into a huge amount of detail. I've just pulled some examples here. So this is one book that's really widely used in teacher education courses. And it says that phonic knowledge is probably best learned through lots of reading and writing. You don't have to teach it. Kids will just imbibe it somehow or other through reading. And it needs to be taught in context. And that's this massive furphy about being taught in context. Of course, phonics needs to be put into context. It doesn't need to be taught in context, at least initially. And in fact, it's best if it's not. And we have academics who are very, very influential on policy and what happens in teacher education courses, who make statements that just are not consistent with the evidence. And in this case, whole language approaches have a significant pedagogical edge over phonics. Now, we saw John's slides this morning. We certainly know that's not the case. It's 0.06 for whole language and 0.7 for phonics. Way at opposite ends of the scale. Even if you said, oh look, there's probably a range of effect sizes around the whole language one, there's a range of effect sizes around phonics, it's pretty unlikely that the effect, that the range is going to cross over sufficiently that you could say perhaps they're similar. And again, there's this whole idea that as long as it's, they're engaged and motivated, that they're learning, and that's not always the case. Again, two very influential people in reading instruction, and the first one is that competent, experienced readers sample just enough visual information to feel satisfied they've grasped the meaning. So you don't actually have to read accurately what the writer has written. As long as you get the gist and you have your own interpretation of it, then that's okay. David Hornsby says, and this is another one, this is talking about about multi-cueing, that the context of the word is more important than the word itself, and that you can't read a word without the context. So he often uses the example of wind and wind. How do you know whether it's wind or wind without context? Well, you need to use phonics to narrow it down to wind and wind. That's how you get to those two choices. Otherwise, if you don't know phonics, it could be banana. So you need to know the phonics first, and then you work out which one it is. So that's how we end up with this sort of advice being given to parents. This comes from a WA public school. I'm spreading the love. All of the states and territories are going to get a mention. And this is the advice to parents when reading with their child. Avoid sounding out words or encouraging students to sound out. So instead, they suggest that it doesn't matter, that there are some inaccurate word reading, that's okay, that's fine. Let them get away with it. Don't correct, don't talk about it. But that's just completely random. That's so subjective. How do you know which reading errors or which are unacceptable miscues in the language? Reading accuracy is extremely important. Another example, I've pulled a few examples off the internet. This is comes from this website is supposedly supporting teachers around how to teach the Australian curriculum. So apparently this is explicit teaching, and these are phonic cues. I don't know if you can see it very, very well, but the list that the teacher is using of phonics cues in explicit teaching are: look at the initial letter sound, picture walk for clues. So use the first letter and then look at the picture and guess. Then look at the whole word, look at letter patterns. So no reading, no sounding out through the word. It's look at the first letter and guess. Again, more phonic cues, looking at initial letter, then looking at the whole word and looking at the picture clues. There was a video put up on the Department of Education website, which are very handily flagged to me by friend Sarah down there, which again says this is an example of how to guide a child in their reading. So you found that from the picture, not from the words. That's very good. Is it any wonder that there's confusion amongst teachers about what is effective reading instruction, when that's the sort of advice they're getting from authorities who are supposed to know? And professional organisations are not getting off the hook either. So this comes from a publication which is called The Place of Phonics in Learning to Read. And it's published by the Australian Literacy Educators Association. It was just revised again a couple of years ago. And it makes this statement, that traditionally reading was viewed simply as a visual cognitive skill required to read the words in alphabetic texts. Getting the words right, that is pronouncing each word correctly, was considered good reading. Comprehension was not the focus. Clearly, just pronouncing the words is no longer sufficient to participate in today's society, blah, blah, blah. Now, I wonder if the writers of the Magna Carta and I wonder if Dickens and James Joyce, I wonder if they agree that that's traditionally what literacy was about, that as long as you could, correctly pronounce the words, the meaning didn't matter. I don't understand how such a statement can be made just so blithely and we're expected to accept it. So the peak professional organisations for literacy in Australia dispute the need for systematic and sequential phonics instruction. So they talk about explicit teaching because they've sort of co-opted that sort of language. But then they qualify it with, in the context of real and relevant texts. So not really explicit teaching at all. It's more that incidental or implicit phonics instruction. And certainly they don't support a Phonics Check. They suggest that the Phonics Check does not reflect current evidence-based research. I don't know what evidence-based research is, but I think they're probably right that Phonics Check doesn't reflect evidence-based research because that's not actually a thing. Literacy programs and assessments that are directed to schools from state and territory governments, again, really don't reflect the evidence on effective reading instruction. So even those teachers who are in classrooms who know what they need to be doing, they know what is most effective with teaching children to read. Sometimes even then they can't do that because they've been directed to use a particular program that they know doesn't work. And New South Wales is a prime example of that with the program called L3. And it very clearly does not reflect the evidence on effective reading instruction, and it itself hasn't ever been evaluated or piloted properly. So all we have is, at the moment in terms of data, is evidence from NAPLAN, and it shows that around about a third of the schools that use L3 have actually gone backwards in NAPLAN since they started using it, and only about a third have gone up, a quarter have gone backwards, and the remainder have just stayed where they were in terms of NAPLAN scores. So that is data that the department has, and yet L3 keeps expanding every year. L3 is actually contradicted by advice from the Centre for Education and Statistics and Evaluation, which supports the 5 keys to reading and explicit instruction, and L3 doesn't have any of that. So this is an email that I got from a teacher in a New South Wales public school who tried to introduce synthetic phonics. Then L3 came in and took over. And so she talks about an underground support network in teaching circles for those who believe in synthetic phonics instruction, which is quite extraordinary, that really that teachers cannot promote the methods of instruction that they know reflect the best evidence. And assessment also. Assessment doesn't reflect what we need to be doing in terms of reading instruction. So it is the case that what gets tested is what gets taught. So if assessments that are being used in state and territory systems don't test certain things, then they possibly won't find their way into the classroom. So all of the states and territories claim that they test phonics, for example. None of them do. So Queensland has an assessment called the Best Start Assessment. So in Year 1 it has a phonics component which supposedly has 10 items. Out of that 10 item group, only 4 are actually about word reading. So are really a test of word accuracy. But the problem is, that's the word progression: bin, blossom, battery, and bacteria. So if a child gets bin right, okay, that's a CVC word, that's lovely. But then the next one is blossom. So if they fail at blossom, you don't know anything about what they know about phonics. All you know is that they can read one CVC word, which possibly is a sight word. The PIPS assessment, again widely used, doesn't actually assess phonics, it assesses phonemic awareness. There's an enormous amount of misunderstanding about the correct terminology around effective reading instruction, which then complicates matters further. I'm going to give a bouquet to the Northern Territory because they've made the most progress in this area by looking at the FELA assessment. So where does professional judgment fit into all of this? Yes, evidence is great, but you're the teacher who's actually in the classroom, actually doing this work. And I'm just going to I've set up 2 kind of different ways of thinking about this, just as a contrast. And one says that, no one's better positioned than the classroom teacher to judge how to best teach. I mean, that's fine as long as you're at least selecting and the sorts of teaching methods or starting with the methods that you think are most likely to be effective given what we know from the evidence, and then evaluating as you go. And then in contrast, I've quoted Pam here, who's pretending to be a pilot, and says, "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. There's probably a particular way I meant to get this Airbus A380 off the ground, but I'd like to try out a few ideas of my own. After all, I'm the pilot and you're my passengers." There's a little bit of middle ground there. There's got to be some experimentation, but it has to be within the realms of what is most likely to work, rather than just having children in the classroom as guinea pigs. So, why? Why then? Why have we still got programs and assessments that don't reflect the best evidence on reading instruction? Why do we have texts in ITE courses that are providing bad information to teachers about how to teach reading? All of those things, and this is where I go into speculation. This is experience. This is what I have discovered working between research and policy. There is a lot of ignorance, as I've been saying, and some people know that they don't know very much about effective reading instruction. Some think they do. And a little bit of knowledge can be a really dangerous thing. So there is a lot of ignorance out there. There is impatience. Teachers and policymakers want a quick fix. They want something that is going to be fun and easy to work on in the classroom and is really effective. But unfortunately, explicit instruction is hard work. It works, but it's hard work. However, it can be done in a way that is engaging. So I often hear teachers say to me that that repetition involved in explicit instruction is really boring. And it's boring for you maybe, but it's not about you, it's about the children, and children actually love repetition. Even if you think it's boring, doesn't mean that they do. There's intransigence. Change is really difficult, and change in an education department is enormously difficult. Change in a school is enormously difficult, but it's really important. There are vested interests. There are people who have their whole career and reputation at stake based on particular programs that have been running for decades. Very difficult to convince those people that they need to be looking at new evidence, perhaps doing something differently. The other one is indoctrination. There are programs where teachers spend a couple of years learning how to teach in a particular way, teach a particular program, and become very narrowly focused on that. So rather than looking at the broad range of evidence and engaging with that, they're very much brought into a very particular worldview that it's very difficult to shake them out of. And of course then there's ideology. People have particular, sometimes quite romantic views about how children learn to read, and this idea that it can't be taught explicitly or you take all of the joy out of it. And they employ standards of evidence that are extremely low. So, and this is continuing, even though we talk about, okay, we're all about evidence now, I see time and time again research being conducted in universities that it can't be seen as evidence. So there's no comparison group, there's no actual decision at the beginning of the project about what's going to be measured, no planning around what the results might be, and how that might be useful in general terms. And that's still an ongoing issue around what constitutes quality evidence, and what are the ranges of evidence or types of evidence that you need. More information, that's where you find it. Thank you.